Okay, so we started last week talking about Philemon. We kind of hit the background of it, that Philemon is a brother, or is a Christian who lives in, actually I'm not exactly sure where Philemon lives. Anybody know off the top of your head?
Where does he live?
Where Philemon lives. I do not remember where.
In the New Testament.
Yes, it is. Actually, we probably do. Or we might have a guess. I'm going to have a look and see what my Bible says here, because that's usually a good source of information about,
I think he's
Colossae.
in Colossae.
Yeah, yep, he's in Colossae. Okay. Paul is more than likely in Rome at this point, but Philemon is in Colossae. So, all right. So Philemon is the master of a slave named Onesimus, who wasn't actually even mentioned until almost halfway through the letter, but who we know from the letter that he's the one actually carrying this letter from Paul back to Philemon. Onesimus was a runaway slave, which under the Roman Empire was a very serious crime. Basically put his life into Philemon's hands. Philemon could have had him executed. Philemon could have done some kind of disfiguring thing to him, or he could have just taken him back as his slave. But regardless, he had basically total control over what happened with him once he ran away. And so Paul writes this letter to Philemon, and he addresses it also to a couple of other people there in Colossae, Apphia and Archippus, and mentions specifically that the church that meets, to the church that meets in their house. Now, it's not entirely clear whether it's the house of Philemon, Apphia, and Archippus, or whether it's the church that meets in Apphia and Archippus' house, and Philemon is a member there, and it doesn't really matter for us. The point is, he writes it to these guys. They would seem to be some of the leaders in that local house church. In most of the larger cities, the way that you would have the church organized was you would have the church in the city, broadly speaking, and that's where most of Paul's letters were written, but then there would be house churches. That was where people actually met. The church might occasionally come together or something, but for the most part, they met in these smaller house churches to avoid unnecessary attention from both the Roman authorities and particularly from the Jews. And so rarely did you have the entire church at Colossae necessarily meeting together, because there wouldn't necessarily have been a good place for them to do that that wouldn't have been very obvious to the authorities. So, Paul is writing to them. He says, grace and peace to you, which is something he says in the vast majority of his letters. And then he begins to, let's see if I can get this thing, there we go. And then he begins to talk about his message. And we talked last week about the idea that one of the keys, I think, to understanding why Philemon is in the New Testament, why God felt like it was important enough to preserve that letter as well as to put it on the hearts of the councils that decided to include it, is because it is a good example of how Christians persuade other Christians to maybe change their mind or do something differently, how we handle conflict in the church. And we have examples of this in other contexts where Paul is intervening in conflict within the church and saying, this is the mindset you should have, this is the attitude you should have. But the difficulty in a lot of cases is actually taking that situation and applying it to a modern situation, because so often Paul's response or his conclusion is situation specific. And so it's easy to say, okay, if we have, some people are willing to eat meat and some people aren't willing to eat meat, then the people who are willing to eat meat can eat meat at home, and people who aren't willing to eat meat can eat, not eat meat, and everybody's going to be okay. Well, that's something we can do at home. That's fine, great. But a lot of our disagreements in modern times have not been, he's eating meat at home, he got to stop. It's not what you're doing in private, unless it's something that's clearly sinful, and then there's a different issue anyway. It's been, what do we do when we're together? And I want it this way, and you want it that way, or I feel like it should be this way, and you feel like it should be that way. What do we do then? Because we can't just say, well, I'll go do it at home. And we don't want our alternative to always be, well, if we can't get along with that, let's just split into two churches. I mean, we could do that. And under some circumstances, maybe that would be something that could be a valid or necessary approach. But in general, that's not what we would consider to be an acceptable or desirable solution. So we end up with this idea of how do we resolve conflict if we don't necessarily have the ability to say, well, you do what you want to do and I'll do what I want to do. How do we deal with that? And so this is something the book of Philemon seems to be focusing on. And so last week we took a little bit of a look at the beginning of Paul's argument to Philemon. And Paul, when he writes, he doesn't waste his time just with pleasantries that are meaningless. Now, at the end of his letters, he sometimes just kind of says hi to people. But the meat of his letters almost always has a purpose, even in the things that he's saying that seem like greetings and compliments and that sort of thing. And so last week we looked at this where Paul says, I thank my God always, making mention of you in my prayers, because I hear of your love and the faith which you have towards the Lord Jesus and toward all the saints. And I pray that the fellowship of your faith may become effective through the knowledge of every good thing which is in you for Christ's sake. And we talked about the idea that maybe what he's trying to focus on here is to focus, or rather what he's trying to focus Philemon's attention towards here, is his faith, is the good things that come through his faith, and the recognition that all of those blessings that have come to him far outweigh the loss of this brother who is a slave of his, and the value of that slave. And so we want him to start thinking, or Paul wants him to start thinking in terms of the love of God, of the love that he has with his fellow Christians, and of the blessings of his discipleship, and to begin to build a foundation then where Paul, when he comes and makes the ask, which is going to be, let him go, let him come back to me, it's not going to be as outrageous as just coming in and saying right out of, you have to let him go because he belongs with me, which would, we know what happens when somebody tells us something like that. Our first response is, no, I don't, here's why, or you're doing this wrong. Well, no, I'm not, and here's why. The tendency when somebody says, do something different, if there's no foundation for it, is to say, no, I don't want to do things different. Now, some of us, if somebody says do something different, we won't necessarily do it in the moment, because my first instinct is to argue, because that's what I've been trained in, and that's, I was trained to do that when I was a kid, not like just a lawyer. I just got reinforced over and over again. So my first instinct is to argue. What I usually will do, though, when somebody tells me something, even if I did initially argue, is I'll kind of mull it over and decide, and think about it more, and then later on, maybe I will do what they said, but not right then. Now, if you can get people to slow down, and you can slow down that instinct to say, no, you're wrong. We can get people to think it through and actually come to the right decision before we have to have the argument and they go away and decide and come back. And that, I think, is what Paul's trying to do here, is to lay down foundation so that rather than when he asks Philemon to release Onesimus, rather than it being something where Philemon is getting hit with this thing out of nowhere and with no basis for doing it, Philemon is instead incentivized to want to think positively of that idea. Okay, so let's pick up with the new stuff in verse 7. Paul says, for I have come to have much joy and comfort in your love, because the hearts of the saints have been refreshed through you, brother. Now, what is he talking about here? Do we even know what he's talking about here? Do we have anything in the book itself, in the letter itself, that would tell us what Philemon has been doing?
Only the references to the faith.
Okay.
And maybe to the church that is in their house. It
Okay.
could be his house. But
Okay.
Apparently, Paul knows him well enough to be able to say this.
Okay, so we have only sort of implied references to this. We don't know specifically what Paul is talking about. But there are a number of other places, a number of other writings that Paul has sent, where he will send something and say, to some particular church, I have been, I hear good things about you, or, you've been doing all these great works and stuff like that. A lot of the individual addresses to the 7 churches in Revelation contain things like this, where Jesus is speaking through John and saying, I know this about you, and I know this about you. And we don't necessarily historically know those things. We don't necessarily know specifically what was being addressed, but there seems to have been, this awareness of that particular church, or this particular issue. And so in this case, it is likely, and this is a guess, but it is likely that Philemon was someone who maybe had some more means, more wealth than the average Christian did. And it may be that he was using his wealth in a way that was supporting people. It is certainly possible that, that he's one of the ones hosting people in his home. And as Jerry says, the key is that Paul knows who he is and seems to know him with a degree of personality. In fact, as we'll see in a little bit here, Paul seems to have been instrumental in Philemon's conversion. So Paul has met Philemon at some point. Paul knows Philemon personally, and Paul feels like something or things that that Philemon is doing is benefiting the saints and is refreshing them. What does it mean to refresh somebody? I'll get to you in a minute.
Encourage.
Encourage, okay? More often than not, it means encourage or build up. So he's been doing things that are building up his fellow saints or encouraging his fellow saints. And again, we don't know exactly what, but that seems to have been something that Paul could highlight as something good about Philemon.
The use of the word love here, and joy and consolation in your love, if the love had not been exhibited in some way by Philemon, Paul would not have known it. Mm-hmm. So it has, I mean, when he says your love is shown, it obviously is something that Philemon is doing to show that love. Yeah.
So whatever it is specifically, we don't necessarily know, but it would seem that Philemon is doing things that show his love for both for Paul and perhaps for the saints more broadly as well. So Paul, it's really important to understand this, and this is a really important thing. If you want to compliment someone, if you want to try to encourage someone by highlighting positive things about them or positive things that they do not make stuff up. Why? Why not?
They know you're lying.
Okay? So only the most raging narcissist is unable to recognize the difference between you telling them, I'm really appreciative of what you've done, versus I'm making stuff up to make you sound like you're good. Okay? And there are people like that. There are people where they don't care what the compliment is, they're going to be happy to get a compliment. But most of us, when somebody says to us, I really appreciate you doing this, if we think, I don't do that, then all that's really doing is kind of highlighting where we are failing. In some cases, you know, it's like giving somebody an alarm clock for a Christmas present. You know, you're probably saying something to them that isn't so much, here's a nice present for you at Christmas, it's probably you show up late a lot, you know. So we want to make sure that when we are being complimentary of people, when we are trying to reinforce what's good about them, that we are legitimately highlighting positive things that they've done, or positive behaviors, or positive attributes that they have. And that's important in the context of trying to create a situation where people are cooperative. So if we're going to try to encourage cooperation, we need to highlight places where they have been cooperative, or highlight positive things that they have done, and not just make stuff up. This can be challenging. I've learned this as a teacher, that it can be, it's oftentimes better to try to highlight something good that someone has done and encourage that, than it is to tell them what they're doing wrong. They tend to be more responsive if you're saying, I really like this that you did, how can I help you do more of that, versus I really hated that you did, how do I make you stop? You know, most people don't like that. Unfortunately, there are some students where it can be a little challenging to find anything to start off with and say, I really like what you were doing there. It's kind of like, wow, everything you just did is wrong. So, you know, it's tricky, but in Paul's case, that doesn't seem to be the situation with Philemon. There is legitimate stuff that he can highlight and bring the attention to, even if we're not seeing the specifics of it in this particular writing. So Paul continues then, and so this is the important thing, that word therefore. What is therefore? What is therefore? What is its significance in the English language?
So.
Because, or so, you know, as a result of this, it is a bridge between here's what I'm saying that's good, and the nice things that I'm saying, or sometimes the bad things that I'm saying, and it is the bridge to, and now here's what I want you to do, or here's what I want you to understand, okay? So it is a transitional term.
But there was a preacher that I remember him, his way he said it, he says, when you see therefore, you need to figure out what it's there for.
That's a good way yeah, because therefore is always the beginning of, and now here's what we do with this. Now maybe it's just sometimes here's what we need to understand about this, but it's still, there's always, this is an important thing for you to understand, okay?
Mine has accordingly.
Accordingly,
Which
all right?
I like, because he just listed all these great attributes, according to those.
Yeah, and that's true. Accordingly is because it's according to what we just said. It's as a result of, it's, you know, because of. So he says, because this is all true, he says, though I have enough confidence in Christ to order you to do what is proper. So he just transitioned, and this is one of those things where we see, you know, you build up this argument, and then you get to that point in the argument, or you build up this foundation, and you get to that point in the foundation where it's time to start putting something up. And when you do, it's hard for the other person to say, oh, you shouldn't have done that, you shouldn't have said that. So Paul transitions, and now he says, I have enough confidence in Christ to order you to do what is proper. Tell me, break that sentence down for me. What is that sentence saying? What is he saying built into there? There's a lot of stuff in that little sentence there.
He's telling him, I'm an apostle, I can tell you what to do.
Yeah, okay.
I have that confidence in what Christ has told me.
Okay.
So
part of this is he's saying, I have the right to do this, and I am confident in my right to do this and in what I could tell you to do if I wanted to. Okay? But beyond that, what do we see in there? Where there's an implication in what Paul says to Philemon based on the fact that he says, I can order you to do it.
It's what Christ wants, not what Paul wants.
Okay, that's really important because he says, I have confidence in Christ order you to do what is proper. He doesn't say what I want you to do or what I think you should do. He says, I have the ability, if I wanted to tell you to do what is the right thing to do. And pretty clearly, we're going to see the right thing to do is to let Onesimus go. Now, is that because Onesimus is a slave, or is that for some other reason? Well, as we go through, we'll kind of look some more at this. I would argue it's probably not simply because Onesimus is a slave. Paul doesn't have a history of going around telling people to free all their slaves or something like that. It appears that the argument is based around more than just, you shouldn't have slaves. So he says, though, I could order you to do what's proper. But instead he says, yet, for love's sake, I rather appeal to you, since I am such a person as Paul, the aged and now also prisoner of Christ Jesus, I appeal to you for my child Onesimus. So rather than ordering him to do what he ought to do, what is he saying he's going to do?
I'd rather have you make the right decision.
Okay.
So he sets him up. He sets him up to where it's almost impossible for him not to do what Paul considers the right thing.
Especially since he's not the only one reading this letter, right? I mean, that's one of the things you don't want to kind of lose sight of is this letter went to at least 2 other people, because it's addressed to at least 2 other people. So, you kind of wonder, like, if Onesimus isn't reading this going, oh, dang. It's kind of, maybe not your first instinct, but your human instinct is, you read that and you're like, well, I wish nobody else had seen this, but he's stuck with it now, So it's hard to say no to this because Paul says, for love's sake, I appeal to you. I'm not going to order you to do what you have to do or what you ought to do. I'm going to appeal to you for love's sake. What does he mean when he says for love's sake?
To love God and to love your neighbor.
Okay.
And for the sake of doing what God wants, I'm appealing to you.
Okay. And I think on top of that, Paul is saying because of the love that we have, I'm appealing to you rather than ordering you. I'm not going to tell you have to do it. I'm going to appeal to you because I believe you'll do the right thing. And this is an important component of love that we sometimes, we know it when it comes to the relationships that we have. We kind of forget about it when we're talking about it in the abstract. One of the components that is contained in a godly kind of a love, whether it's the agape love that is literally the godly love, or whether it's a godly version of the love that husbands and wives have, or that brothers have, or whatever, is an element of trust. And I think that's something that, for me, that has always been one of the major handicaps to my ability to have long-term relationships. Is I have trouble completely trusting people with anything. And part of that is my background, part of that is my experiences, part of that is just me, and part of that's definitely not a good thing, but it's just the reality. I struggle with that, okay? And I think a lot of us do. As our world becomes more and more messed up, I think we all become more and more cynical, and it gets harder and harder to trust people. But so what Paul is saying here is because I love you, I trust that you will do the right thing. I don't have to order you to do the right thing. I have trust in you, I have faith in you that you're going to do the right thing. And here again, this is not a principle that we find just among people. God also says the same thing to us. He says, I love you and I am entrusting you with the church. And I am entrusting you with the gospel. And I have faith, I have a belief that you ever think that God had faith in something? Isn't that interesting? I have a belief that you will do the right thing with it. That's why I'm giving it to you. So we see in Christianity the willingness to treat people as adults, both from God's standpoint for man and between men, in part because of the love that we have and the love that we share in Christ Jesus. And then, yeah, that next step, which is, and because you have love, and I know you have love for God and for the saints, then I am confident that what you're going to do with that love, now that I've put this before you, is you're going to do the right thing when it comes to Onesimus. And you're not going to punish him, you're not going to persecute him, instead you're going to do something different.
So I think the difference between verse 8 and verse 9 is we are coming out of Judaism, where everything is a checklist. Your heart is not involved, it's duty over want. And so Philemon's going to do this no matter what at this point, right? And either you're going to do it out of duty, verse 8, or you're going to do it out of love. And to me, this is the difference of asking for the floor to be vacuumed and, and getting it done begrudgingly,
Right.
versus not having to ask and getting it done, thought it would help out the family. It's a completely different attitude.
Yeah.
And so Paul's like, you're gonna do this, but we don't want it to be begrudgingly. I'm gonna try
Right.
to make it so it's not begrudging.
Okay. So I think, Karen, did you raise your hand?
I
And then
did.
I'll get to Steve after that. So we have the whole family here.
There's an example coming.
Well, there's what?
An example coming.
Of course there is. So any of us who are parents have used this appeal with our children at one time or another. And I've used it a lot. I hear Sarah and Ian use it with the girls. You know, I know that you're doing this, but maybe we could do such and such. You know, it's a training. So I guess what I'm saying is that all of us, no matter where we are in Christ, sometimes we need this training, this reminder. I mean, I wrote to Casey at school and said, well, I know that you're just doing this and that, and I'm so proud of you, and I knew he wouldn't. But he started, you know, because he want the love, he wanted to do the right thing. He had been trained to do that. He just kind of lost his brain. But he found it, and things got better. And, you know, it's part of training your children.
Yeah.
And the older I get, the more I see, I see God as a father, a parent. I can understand it more, I guess, as a parent, because I can see so many things in life as well as spiritual.
And I think one of the things, and this is something I understand intellectually without understanding it in practice the way that most of you who are parents do, as you get older as parents, you also see that progression as well, because you start off with your kids and you pretty much have to tell them what to do. And in many cases, you can't even explain why they should do what you're telling them to do, because they're not mentally in a place where they would be able to grasp that explanation, or that it would be significant to them, or that it would mean anything to them. And so you progress from, here's what you have to do, and I don't care whether you think it's a good idea or not, to here's what you have to do and here's why, to here's some freedom to make your own decisions about what to do, but there's still some things you have to do, to eventually a place where it's, you're going to have to make your own choices because you're not under my control anymore. And if I've created the foundation where you make the right choices, that's great. And if I haven't, or it hasn't been laid down, then that's going to turn out badly. It's just not going to go real well. And sometimes, even if we have laid the foundation, it still doesn't go well. The people get to make their own choices, and it doesn't matter how much foundation, sometimes people make bad choices. But in general, the mistake that I see happening with my students is either parents who are too quick to let their kids start making their own choices and not really providing the framework and the groundwork to actually make good choices, and they just start, you know, they want to be their friends and they want to make them happy and they just let them do whatever they want to. Or parents who will not let their children make their own choices. I deal with mostly seniors, and at this point most seniors should have a significant element of freedom to make their own choices, and many of them do, and many of them more than I think they should, but some of them have almost none. And these are the ones that really can't even conceive of living away from their parents, because that's the world that their parents have created for them. So as parents, you guys have to figure out for yourselves, and for each child, because I don't think it's the same for every kid either, you have to figure out how much freedom can I give them, when should I give them that freedom, how do I make sure that I'm structuring that freedom in a way that helps them to grow up, and then let them go. And we see this principle in the scriptures where God talks about you know, or not so much God, but some of the writers in the New Testament, in particular Paul, talk about, you know, that Judaism was for kids. I mean, he doesn't use the word kids, but he does talk about the child, the one that's, you know, the one that's under the parent's control, that is not given decision-making authority, that they have an inheritance, but they're not given control over. And Judaism is given to that child as a way to structure and order and compel behavior, but also to give them a sense of how they should structure things so that when they are given freedom, they act properly. And then Christianity is the new covenant that replaces that old covenant and says, okay, now it's not going to be because you have to, it's not going to be because it's just a bunch of rules, it's going to be principles mostly, and you're going to be expected to apply those principles like a grown-up would apply the things that they learned as a child to the principles of their lives. And so this training process isn't something that just stops them. So just because that is the idea behind Christianity and Judaism doesn't mean that that as soon as somebody becomes a Christian, we're like, okay, freedom, good luck, you know, see what happens, you know. There's still a building of structures, there's still, I think you said, a reinforcing of these principles to remind people about how to make good decisions and how to make the choices that they ought to make. And it requires a foundation of love and a foundation of the scriptures. And then from there, it is increasing levels of freedom to help people to figure out what to do.
Well, Sarah and Casey, Ian and they make their own decisions. We've done the best we can. We will always be their mentors, but they have to make those decisions. Just like the rest of us, we're mentors to our children. We're mentors to those around us. Our children are a little closer to our hearts, of course, but we're mentors to everyone around us by the way we live.
Yeah. And because people respect the way that you live. And in many cases for parents, the people who respect the way you raised your kids, that also tends to create a level of respect, especially from, I know this happened with my parents, that younger parents would go to my parents for advice of what to do because they had done well, you know. And so that can be a really valuable reinforcing process. I saw Buck's hand, I had Steve already. Steve, do you have something?
Well, there's not a whole lot left, but I was going to make the point that you did quite well already, in that this really encapsulates the concept of our relationship with God. God doesn't just order us to do things, but He wants us for the love of Him, for the sake of love, to obey Him and be the right person and make the right decisions. And I'm reminded about a story, I think a parable, about a father that told his two sons to do something, and the one said, okay, I'll do it, but then did not. And the other said, no, I'm not going to do it, but then went and did it. And so which was the obedient son? And so here we have a father that appeals to us, and sometimes we resist, but ultimately we need to make the choice of obedience.
Yeah. Jesus says, if you love me, you'll follow my commandments. He doesn't say follow my commandments no matter how you feel about it. It begins with the love and then the obedience flows out of it. And
don't just serve me with words.
Yeah, and I think there's a really critical difference there between, and that is one of the big differences between Judaism and Christianity. Judaism was not just a belief system. For the original conception of Judaism was a governmental system as well. If you don't follow the rules, we can make bad things happen to you in the here and now. Christianity is not like that. The only real power that we have over someone who's not following God's law is to basically say, you know, we can't really associate with you anymore. And if somebody's far enough off track, they don't care. This is a voluntary activity, a purely choice-based, am I going to do this or not, especially in our modern society where it is just as valid in the mind of society to not be part of a church as it is to be part of a church. Now, you go back in history a ways, if you're not part of a church in a small community, you're going to be ostracized. But we're not there anymore. This is purely voluntary. And so if there isn't love, if there isn't a desire to be obedient, it's just not going to work. You can't make people do those things in this kind of a world, in this kind of a culture, unless you have something more than just, I'm telling you, you have to do this. But, go ahead.
Well, I really didn't raise my hand, but I will
sorry.
say, it's, I don't know how to explain it, it's up to the parents to get them to believe in God and do this, but once they get to a certain age, it's kind of, iffy. how much we should preach to them, like, for lack of a better word,
Yeah.
to keep them on the straight and narrow.
At some point you have to basically, and this is by my observation again, but you have to temper teaching with example, with consequence. And that's the thing, you can tell a little kid, don't touch the stove, don't touch the stove, don't touch the stove. At some point, if they simply keep trying to touch the stove, you may have to let them touch the stove to find out why they're not supposed to touch the stove. Now maybe you don't want to let them put their hand flat down on it or something like that, but the reality is that when somebody gets to be an adult, part of the job of parenting is to say, you know what, now you're going to also have to deal with some of the consequences of the choices that you're making. And I think that's where I see parents struggle the most. And again, I'm talking to somebody who doesn't have the relationship there, so it's easy for me to say. But one of the things that I see most often happen with parents with their teenagers is they protect them from the consequences even as they give them more and more freedom. And this is maybe the most dangerous lesson of all to teach. That you can make whatever choice you want to, and I'm going to make sure that nothing bad happens to you as a result of that. So, and it doesn't happen very often, but I have the students who won't do their homework or who won't get ready for tests, and they come and they do poorly on it, and then I have the parents calling on me up and they're mad because why do they have a 0? Why can't my kid play sports this week when they've turned in the last 6 assignments and they bombed the last test and make any effort to make it up or improve it? And I'm saying, this is why they can't. Well, why can't you make some extra credit for them? Because that's not my job, to make extra credit for them, to fix the fact that they didn't do the things they were supposed to do when they could have done them. And so we have this need sometimes to say, okay, here's the principle, here's what we've trained you to do, here's the foundation. Now make your own decisions, but understand that you are going to bear the consequences of those decisions. And we're gonna keep welcoming you back, but we're not gonna keep fixing everything for you. I think that's a really important aspect of this. So Paul says, I appeal to you, and this I think is really interesting, I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my imprisonment. What does he mean by that? What is he saying there?
Mine says, whose father I became.
Okay. So either way, we're talking about the same. So how did he become Onesimus' father, and how is Onesimus his child?
Mentorship.
Okay, the mentorship, I would go a step further than that, I think, and this is hypothetical, but based on what Paul says, I think almost certainly that he converted Onesimus, that he probably encountered Onesimus as a runaway slave who was fallen from grace, and not that he was a Christian in the first place, but fallen from Philemon's grace. He may have even been run away by the time when Paul first met Philemon, and so it's entirely possible that Paul met Philemon, and in talking to Philemon, he found out about this runaway slave, and then later on, through what would almost certainly be the providence of God, he encounters this runaway slave. But either way, it is providential that Onesimus encounters Paul. And Paul is almost certainly the one who converts him to Christianity and thus becomes his father. And the reason I'm pretty confident of that is because he uses similar language in several other of his writings, referring to members of the church who were his, or to churches who were founded by him, where he basically says, you are my children because I converted you. Okay, so he says, I'm appealing to you, and in the phrasing here, he's going to talk about him in terms of him being a brother to Philemon in a minute here, but he starts off by talking about him as his child. Why would you think he would use that phrasing when he's talking to Philemon, remembering the context of what he's trying to do with this letter?
What context?
So what I'm, and I think Mark's got it, but so what I'm asking is, why would he refer to Onesimus as his child who he has begotten in what he's writing to Philemon? And I think correctly, he's saying he is valuable to me, he is dear to me. He's going to go on to talk more about his value, but he's really saying, this is my kid now, and I'm sending my kid back to you with this letter, and he's obedient because he's bringing it with him. But I want you to think of him as my child rather than as your runaway slave.
In my Bible, it says that Onesimus means useful.
Okay, and then
he uses the opposite phrase here, useless.
So he actually does a play on words, and Paul does this a lot. We don't know it because it's in a different language, but he actually says, formerly he was useless to you. So Onesimus, useful, not useful to you because he ran away. And my guess is, if he's a runaway slave, what kind of slave do you think he was before he ran away? Not a very good one. Yeah. I mean, the kind of slave who will run away is the kind of slave who's probably not trying very hard. At least the only reason he's trying hard is to kind of build up his master confidence so he can get away from him,
There
you know?
didn't seem to be a search for him.
Yeah, okay. So he's useless to you, but has been, I should say, useless to you, but is now useful both to you and to me. So why is Onesimus useful now?
Because he's been born.
Okay. He's been born again. He has been reborn. He has that loving relationship, that relationship through Christ, and so now he is useful to Paul, most certainly, especially in Paul's imprisonment. But how is he useful to Philemon? Especially since Paul's going to ask him to give it back to him.
Because Philemon is a fellow worker.
Okay. And Philemon's ultimate goal as a fellow worker is what?
To build a congregation.
That's right. To build the church, to build the gospel, to preach the gospel. So anybody who helps to get that done, goes back to a principle Jesus was talking about. When the apostles have gone out and they've done all these miraculous things and they come back and then they see some people going out and in Jesus' name they're doing miraculous things and they're doing things and they say, should we tell them to stop? And Jesus says, no, don't tell them to stop. They're as long as the kingdom is being preached, these guys are on your side. Now, later on, he's going to talk about, when you do tell somebody to stop, and that's when they're not teaching the right things, they're not doing the right things, but when somebody is doing the right thing and teaching the word, that's the kingdom is being preached. That's the goal, Jesus says. So from Philemon's perspective, if he's got the right understanding of this, and Paul believes he does, then he would be understanding Onesimus as valuable, not so much because he's going to come back and work in Philemon's field or something like that, but because he's now helping to spread the gospel, helping to do the thing that Christians are supposed to believe is the most important thing, which is spreading the gospel and doing the will of God. And so Philemon has become useful because of his transformation. And recognizing that, Paul wants Philemon also to recognize that and to understand that Onesimus is no longer what he was before. Okay, so let me see here. I think we will stop here. We'll finish this up next week because when we get into this next one, it'll get us way over time, and we're almost right at the quarter after anyway. So we'll pick up with the fact that Onesimus is the one carrying the letter. So thank you guys for your participation. We got one more week on this, and then we'll start Romans the week after that.